I was 18 years old when my father told me to get out, not suggested, not recommended, told me. You have until Sunday to pack your things and leave this house. It was a Thursday evening in March 1978. Dinner was over. My mother had cleared the plates. My younger brother was doing homework at the kitchen table. Normal evening. Then my father dropped that bomb. The reason, I'd told him I wasn't going to take over the family business, Henderson Hardware. 3 generations of Hendersons had run that store on Main Street in Millbrook, Pennsylvania. My grandfather started it in 1923. My father expanded it in 1955, and I was supposed to be Generation 4, but I didn't want it. Didn't want to spend my life selling hammers and nails and paint to the same people in the same small town, doing the same thing day after day until I died. I wanted something different, didn't know what exactly, just knew it wasn't that. My father took it as a personal insult, took it as rejection, took it as me saying his life's work wasn't good enough for me. So he gave me 3 days. 3 days to figure out the rest of my life. My name is David Henderson. That Thursday night, I had $243 in my savings account. Had a 1971 Chevy Nova that barely ran. Had a high school diploma, and not much else. No college plans. No job lined up. No idea what I was doing. Sunday came. I packed everything I owned into 4 cardboard boxes and loaded them in the Nova. My mother cried, but didn't argue with my father, never did. My brother shook my hand and whispered he was sorry. My father stood on the porch with his arms crossed and watched me drive away. I made it about 40 miles before the reality hit me. I had nowhere to go, nobody to call. $243, that wouldn't last a month. Pulled into a rest stop and just sat there trying not to panic. Watched families getting out of station wagons. Watched truckers grabbing coffee. Watched people who had destinations and purposes and plans. I had none of those things. That's when I saw the newspaper someone had left on the picnic table. Local classifieds, help wanted section. Most of the jobs required experience I didn't have or education I didn't possess, but one caught my eye. Farm help needed, room and board included, must be willing to work hard. No experience necessary. Call Walter. I used the payphone and called the number. Man answered on the 3rd ring. Voice like gravel. Asked if I knew anything about farming. I told him no, but I could learn. Asked if I was lazy. I told him no. Asked if I could start Monday. I said yes. He gave me directions to a farm outside Harrisburg. Said to be there by 6 in the morning. Said he'd give me 30 days to prove I wasn't worthless. If I made it 30 days, he'd pay me $50 a week, plus room and board. If I didn't make it, I was out. I slept in my car that night in the rest stop parking lot. Showed up at Walter Morrison's farm at 5:45 the next morning. Walter was 71 years old, owned 200 acres that he'd been farming since 1945. Wife had died in 1974. Kids had moved away and weren't coming back. He needed help and couldn't afford to pay much. I needed a place to stay and would work for almost nothing. We were a good match. Those first weeks were brutal. I'd never worked that hard in my life. Up at 5, working until dark. Everything hurt. My hands blistered, then calloused. My back ached. My muscles screamed. But I didn't quit. Couldn't afford to quit. Walter didn't talk much those first weeks. Just showed me what needed doing and expected me to figure it out. Fix fence, feed livestock, muck stalls, clean equipment, plant seeds, pull weeds, everything that keeps a farm running. But I watched him. watched how he worked, how he thought through problems, how he maintained equipment that was older than I was and kept it running, how he understood soil and weather and timing in ways that seemed almost instinctive. The farm had equipment from every decade since the 40s. Walter never threw anything away, never bought new when old could be fixed. His main tractor was a 1952 Farmall Super M. His backup was a 1947 John Deere Model A. His truck was a 1960 Ford F-100 that had over 300,000 miles on it. Everything was old. Everything still worked. One Saturday afternoon in May, Walter took me to an estate auction about 15 miles away. Old farmer had died. Family was selling everything. Lifetime of accumulated farm equipment and tools going to the highest bidder. We walked through, looking at items before the bidding started. Most of it was junk. Rusted equipment, broken tools. Things that should have gone to the scrapyard decades ago. Then I saw it, sitting in the back corner of the barn, covered in dust and bird droppings and decades of neglect. But I could still make out the faded red paint, the distinctive grille design, the narrow front wheels. It was a 1936 Farmall F-20 tractor, one of the early row crop models, built back when Farmall was revolutionizing agriculture with tractors specifically designed for row crops instead of just pulling plows. I'd been reading everything I could find about vintage farm equipment. Walter had boxes of old farming magazines in his basement. I'd spend evenings reading about tractor development, about the companies that built them, about the innovations that changed farming. I knew what I was looking at. Walter walked over and stood beside me, looked at the old Farmall for a long moment. "That's a F-20, he said quietly. "Don't see many of those anymore. Most got scrapped in the 50s when farmers upgraded. This one's been sitting here probably 30 years. Think it could run again?" I asked. Walter walked around it slowly, looked at the engine, checked the transmission, examined the rear wheels. Finally, he said, "Maybe. Would take a lot of work. A lot of parts, a lot of time." "How much do you think it'll go for?" "Not much. Nobody wants a tractor this old. Can't use it for real work. Too small, too outdated. Most folks here will be bidding on the newer equipment." The auction started at noon. I watched item after item sell: plows, planters, newer tractors from the 60s and 70s. Good equipment bringing good prices. The F-20 came up around 3 in the afternoon. The auctioneer described it as a vintage tractor, non-running, sold ASS, asked for opening bids of $100. Nobody bid, dropped it to $50. Still nothing. $25, the auctioneer said. "Someone give me $25 for this piece of history." I raised my hand before I could think about what I was doing. "Sold to the young man in the back for $25. Walter looked at me, didn't say anything, just looked. I used money I'd earned that month, cleaned out most of my savings. We borrowed a trailer and hauled that F-20 back to Walter's farm, parked it in his old machinery shed. That night at dinner, Walter said, "You bought yourself a project. Going to take more than $25 to get that thing running. I know, but I want to try." "Why?" "Can't use it for anything practical. It's obsolete." I thought about that. Tried to put into words something I didn't fully understand myself. Finally, I said, "Because somebody built it to last, built it to be useful, and it was useful for probably 30 or 40 years, then people just abandoned it, decided it wasn't worth keeping. I don't think things that were built that well should just be thrown away and forgotten." Walter nodded slowly. Then he said something I'll never forget. He said, "You might be right. World's too quick to throw away anything that's not new and shiny, including people. I started working on that F-20 every evening after the regular farm work was done. Weekends, when I had time, slowly, carefully, teaching myself as I went. First thing was getting it cleaned up. Decades of accumulated dirt and grease and grime, bird droppings from pigeons that had roosted in that barn for years, mouse nests inside the air cleaner and under the seat cushion, wasp nests in the exhaust manifold. Nature had reclaimed this machine. I scrubbed every inch with degreaser and wire brushes, removed the engine panels to access the block and head, cleaned out the cooling system that was full of rust and sediment, pulled the fuel tank and found it completely varnished inside from old gasoline that had turned to gel, removed the carburetor and found it so clogged I couldn't even see through the jets. The magnitude of the project was overwhelming at first. Every time I fixed one thing, I'd discover 3 more things that needed attention. But I kept at it, documented everything, took photographs, made notes, created a system. Walter would come by sometimes in the evenings and watch me work. He'd lean against the doorframe of the machinery shed, coffee cup in hand, just observing. Sometimes he'd give advice when I asked, show me how to use a particular tool, lend me his torque wrench or bearing puller, demonstrate the proper way to lap valves or clean piston rings. But mostly, he let me figure things out myself, let me make mistakes and learn from them. I remember one night in August when I was trying to remove the head bolts. They'd been on there for over 40 years and were seized solid. I'd been working on one bolt for 30 minutes, tried penetrating oil, tried heat, tried everything I could think of. Finally, in frustration, I put too much force on the wrench and snapped the bolt head clean off. I just sat there on the floor, staring at that broken bolt, wanted to quit, wanted to give up. This was impossible. I didn't know what I was doing. Why was I wasting time and money on this? Walter set his coffee cup down and walked over, looked at the broken bolt. Then he said, every restoration has at least one of those moments. Moment where you think you've ruined everything, can't be fixed. Might as well quit. He paused, then continued. But here's what I've learned in 71 years. Most things that seem impossible are just difficult. And difficult just means you haven't figured out the solution yet. Doesn't mean there isn't one. He showed me how to drill out the broken bolt shaft and use an extractor to remove it. Took us 2 hours, but we got it out. Taught me more about patience and problem solving than any book could have. I started ordering parts through mail-order catalogs I'd found in Walter's collection of old farming magazines, companies that specialized in obsolete tractor parts, small operations run by enthusiasts who understood that these machines still mattered to some people. I'd call them on Walter's phone, describe what I needed, and they'd search their inventory. Sometimes they had it. Sometimes they'd have to fabricate it. Sometimes they'd suggest alternatives or workarounds. My weekly pay of $50 mostly went to tractor parts. I lived on very little. Ate simple meals, didn't go to town for entertainment, didn't buy new clothes unless I absolutely needed them. Every dollar that wasn't essential for survival went into that F20. Walter noticed, but never said anything negative about it. I think he understood obsession, understood what it meant to care deeply about something most people didn't see value in. The engine work took months. Each component had to be carefully examined, measured, cleaned, and either reused or replaced. The pistons showed scoring from years of running without proper oil filtration. The cylinder walls needed to be honed smooth again. The valves needed grinding to seat properly. The crankshaft bearings were worn beyond tolerance and had to be replaced. I learned to use micrometers to measure cylinder bore, learned to read a shop manual and understand engineering specifications, learned the difference between acceptable wear and damage that required replacement, learned that quality parts matter and cheap shortcuts come back to haunt you. 6 months after I bought it, I finally got the engine completely disassembled, cleaned, and reassembled with new parts where necessary. Got it freed up so it would turn over by hand. Good compression on all cylinders. Another month of work on the fuel system. Cleaned every passage in that carburetor until I could see daylight through the jets. Rebuilt the fuel pump. Installed new fuel lines. Cleaned out the entire fuel system from tank to engine. The electrical system was primitive by modern standards but still needed attention. The generator had to be rebuilt. The voltage regulator cleaned and adjusted. Every wire inspected and replaced if insulation was cracked or corroded. New spark plugs, new distributor points and condenser. One evening in December, almost 9 months after I'd bought it, everything was finally ready. Engine reassembled, all systems checked, fresh oil, clean fuel, battery charged. I set the choke like the manual instructed, turned the key to prime the fuel system, let it sit for a moment. Then I pushed the starter button. The engine cranked slowly at first, the starter motor pulling against decades of inertia and tight new piston rings. It cranked once, twice, 3 times. Then suddenly, it caught. One cylinder fired, then another. Black smoke poured out the exhaust from oil that had accumulated during the rebuild. The engine ran rough for about 10 seconds, then smoothed out as fuel flow stabilized. That 1936 Farmall F20 was running for the first time in probably 30 years. The sound of that 4-cylinder engine, that distinctive industrial power unit sound that Farmall was known for, echoing off the walls of Walter's machinery shed. Walter came out of the house when he heard the engine. I'd been so focused on getting it started, I hadn't noticed how late it had gotten. Must have been after 9 at night. He stood in the doorway of the shed in his pajamas and jacket, listening to that old engine running. He was smiling. I'd never seen Walter smile before that moment. "You did it," he said over the engine noise. "Brought it back from the dead. That tractor was scrap metal when you bought it. Now listen to it run. Smooth as the day it was built." I let it run for about 20 minutes, watching all the gauges, checking for leaks, listening for any unusual sounds. Everything looked good. Everything sounded right. Finally, I shut it down. Sat there on the seat in the silence afterward, just trying to process what I'd accomplished. I was 19 years old. A year ago, I'd been kicked out of my father's house with nothing. Now, I'd completely restored a 1936 tractor from a pile of rust and forgotten metal into a running piece of mechanical history. Done it mostly by myself. Figured it out through research and trial and error and sheer determination not to quit. That night changed something fundamental in how I saw myself. I wasn't the failure my father had implied I was. Wasn't the kid with no future. I was someone who could take something broken and make it whole again. Someone who could learn complex skills. Someone who could finish what he started. Over the next few months, I kept working on it. Got the engine running perfectly smooth. Rebuilt the clutch so it engaged properly. Completely rebuilt the brake system with new shoes and springs. Replaced all 4 tires with period-correct rubber from a specialty supplier. Started on the sheet metal and paintwork. Word got around the farming community. The kid staying at Walter's place had restored an old F20. Farmers would stop by to look at it. Some were impressed. Some thought I was crazy for spending time and money on obsolete equipment. One of the visitors was a man named Harold Hutchins. He was about 60. Ran the County Historical Society. He looked at that F-24 a long time. Asked me questions about the restoration, about where I'd found parts, about what I'd learned. Then he said something interesting. He said, "You know there's a tractor show every summer in York. People bring restored vintage tractors, show them, talk about them, preserve the history. You should bring this." I'd never heard of such a thing. Tractor shows. People who collected and restored old farm equipment as a hobby. A whole community of people who thought these machines were worth saving. Harold gave me information, addresses, phone numbers, names of other people doing similar work. Opened up a world I didn't know existed. That summer, I took the F-20 to the York Tractor Show. Trailered it down with Walter's help using his old truck and flatbed trailer. Took us 3 hours to get there on back roads because the truck couldn't handle highway speeds. Set it up in my assigned spot among hundreds of other restored tractors, and I was completely overwhelmed. I'd never seen anything like this. Acres of vintage tractors. Every make and model you could imagine. Farmalls, and John Deere's, and Alice Chambers, and Oliver and Minneapolis Molen, and Case, and dozens of other brands I'd never heard of. Tractors from the teens and 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s. Some restored to absolute perfection. Others preserved in original condition with authentic patina and wear. There were vendors selling parts and memorabilia. There were demonstrations of antique equipment actually working in the fields. There were swap meets where people traded components. There were judging competitions for best restoration. There was a whole world here I'd known nothing about. My F-20 looked amateur compared to some of these restorations. My paint job was good but not perfect. My decals were slightly off-center. The seat cushion I'd made myself wasn't quite the right material, but I'd done it myself. Every bolt, every wire, every part. It was mine in a way those perfect restorations weren't. People started stopping to look at it within an hour of setting up. Older men, mostly, in their 60s and 70s. They'd walk up slowly, studying the tractor from different angles. Then they'd start talking. One man named Carl, must have been 75 years old, stood there for 10 minutes, just looking at it. Finally he said, "My father bought one of these new, in 1937. I learned to farm on it. First tractor I ever drove. I was 9 years old. Sat on my dad's lap and steered while he worked the clutch and throttle. That tractor farmed our place for 23 years before we upgraded to something newer. Always wondered what happened to it. Probably scrapped, like most of them were." He told me stories for half an hour about learning to plow straight rows, about the time he nearly drove it into a creek, about how revolutionary it seemed compared to farming with horses, about how his father had saved for 3 years to afford it, about what it meant to their family's survival during the Depression. I realized I wasn't just restoring a machine. I was preserving memories, keeping alive experiences that would otherwise be forgotten when that generation died. More people came by throughout the day. Some were restorers who wanted to talk about technical details, what parts were hardest to find, what techniques I'd used, where I'd sourced period-correct components. They offered advice on things I could improve. Shared resources, welcomed me into their community. Younger people would stop too. Kids with their parents, teenagers. They'd ask what it was for, why anyone would want an old tractor, what you could do with it. I'd explain about agricultural history, about how farming changed over the decades, about how this particular model helped make row crop farming more efficient. Some of them got it, understood that history matters, that progress builds on what came before. A photographer from a farming magazine came by, took pictures of the F20, asked me questions about my story. 18 years old, kicked out by my father. Bought this tractor for $25, restored it myself while working on a farm. He seemed skeptical at first, like maybe I was exaggerating, but Walter was there and confirmed everything. The photographer said, "That's a good story. Human interest angle. Mind if we run a feature article about you and the restoration?" 2 months later, that article appeared in Mid-Atlantic Farming Heritage magazine. 3 pages with photos. Told my whole story. Included Walter's quotes about teaching me. Explained the significance of the F20 model. Showed before and after photos of the restoration. My phone, at Walter's farm, started ringing. Other people doing restorations wanted advice. People who had old tractors sitting in barns wanted to know if I'd be interested in buying them. Museum curators wanted to know if I'd loan the F24 exhibits. Suddenly, I was part of something bigger than I'd imagined. I met other restorers through that article. Guys doing similar work, preserving agricultural heritage one machine at a time. Some of them became mentors, taught me advanced techniques, connected me with parts suppliers, invited me to other shows and events. One of them was a man named Frank Kowalski from Ohio. He'd been restoring tractors for 30 years, had a barn full of immaculately restored equipment. He drove out to Walter's farm one Saturday to meet me and see my work. Spent 4 hours looking at the F20, asking questions, testing my knowledge, checking my attention to detail. Finally he said, "You've got potential, kid. You did good work on this, but you could do better. You want to learn how to do museum-quality restorations? Come spend a weekend at my place. I'll show you what I know." I went. Learned more in that weekend than I had in the previous year. Frank showed me professional techniques, how to properly strip and prepare metal for painting, how to match period-correct colors exactly, how to source authentic decals and apply them perfectly, how to photograph your work to document the process, how to research a tractor's history and verify authenticity. He also taught me about the community, about the collectors and museums and historians who cared about this stuff, about opportunities to work in the field, about making a living doing what I loved. "You're young," he said. "You've got time to build something real here. This can be more than a hobby. This can be your career if you're smart about it and dedicated enough." Over the next 2 years, living at Walter's farm, I restored 4 more tractors, bought them cheap at auctions, fixed them up, sometimes sold them, sometimes kept them, built a reputation in the vintage tractor community. Walter's health started declining in 1981. He was 74. The farm was getting to be too much. We talked about his options. His kids didn't want it. He couldn't run it alone much longer. He offered to sell me the farm, said I'd proven myself, said he trusted me with it, offered it at a price I could actually afford with financing. I was 21 years old. I bought 200 acres and became a farmer, but I didn't farm it the traditional way. I farmed enough to pay the bills, but I turned the rest of it into something different. A workshop for tractor restoration. A place where vintage equipment could be stored and maintained. A teaching facility where I could show young people how these machines worked. By 1985, I'd restored over 30 tractors, built a museum barn to display them, started hosting events, brought in other collectors, created something unique. The vintage tractor community started calling it Henderson's Preservation Farm. People would come from other states to see the collection, to learn restoration techniques, to be part of saving agricultural history. My father heard about it eventually. Small towns talk. Word gets around. Heard his son, who'd been too good for the family hardware business, had become somewhat successful doing something weird with old tractors. He showed up one Saturday in 1986, 8 years after he'd kicked me out, walked through the museum barn, looking at restored tractors, watched me teach a workshop on engine rebuilding, saw what I'd built. We talked, not about the past, about what I was doing. He asked questions, actual interested questions, about the history, about the restoration process, about why it mattered. Finally he said, "I thought you were just being stubborn, refusing to do what I wanted out of spite. I didn't understand you actually wanted something different, something specific." I told him I didn't understand it either back then, just knew I didn't want what he was offering, had to find my own thing. He nodded, then he said, "Your grandfather would have liked this. He was a pack rat, never threw anything away, drove my mother crazy. He'd have understood what you're doing here." That was as close to an apology as I'd get, but it was enough. The original F20 I bought for $25 is still here. Never sold it, never will. It sits in the place of honor in the main barn. A plaque next to it explains its significance, not because it's rare or valuable, but because it's the tractor that changed my life, the tractor that showed me old things have value, that history matters, that things built to last deserve to be preserved. That tractor has been featured in magazines, in documentaries about agricultural history, in textbooks about farm equipment evolution. Museums have offered to buy it. Collectors have made serious offers. Always say no, because that F20 represents something bigger than its mechanical components. It represents what happens when an 18-year-old kid with no plan and no future puts his last few dollars into something everyone else thinks is worthless. It represents the idea that your life doesn't have to follow the path other people plan for you, that you can create your own purpose, find your own meaning, build your own legacy. Today, the Henderson Agricultural Heritage Museum spans 50 acres. We have over 200 restored tractors representing every major manufacturer from 1920 to 1980. We host workshops, school field trips, research programs. We've trained hundreds of young people in restoration skills. We've preserved machines that would have been scrapped, saved history that would have been lost, created a place where people can connect with the agricultural past, all because a kid got kicked out of his house and spent his last $25 on a tractor nobody else wanted. My father eventually understood. Near the end of his life, he told me he was proud, said I'd built something more lasting than the hardware store ever was, said I'd made Henderson a name people would remember. He was right, but not because of anything he did, because of what I did after he forced me to find my own way. I was 18 with nothing, bought a forgotten tractor for $25, restored it, and in doing so, found myself. That F20 didn't just become part of history, it made history, not because of what it was, because of what it represented. The idea that things worth saving are worth fighting for, even when everyone else has given up on them, even when everyone else has given up on you. My name is David Henderson. I was kicked out at 18. I bought an old tractor, and what it became changed everything. Not just for me, for everyone who's visited this museum. For every kid who's learned that old doesn't mean worthless. For every person who's discovered that preservation is a form of rebellion against a throwaway world. That tractor taught me the most important lesson I ever learned. Your value isn't determined by other people's opinions. It's determined by what you do with what you have, even when what you have is almost nothing. I had $25 and a tractor nobody wanted, turned it into a life worth living and a legacy worth leaving. That's what history looks like. Not grand gestures, small decisions that compound over time into something significant. One tractor, one kid, one choice to save instead of discard. That's all it took.